Why?
You know, well, look, this is a question I think you're asking me is, why is 2 + 2 = 4? That makes no sense. If 2 + 2 would equal 4, regardless of whether God exists or not, and all you're giving are evidential arguments. Every one of your arguments doesn't guarantee truth, it's an evidential argument.
If there is no God, there is no purpose to life, and we're just overgrown germs. We're just, as someone said, we're either God imagers or we're clever, murderous monkeys fighting for control over the banana supply.
I don't.
See what happens when an atheist professor challenges morality without God, and see how Frank Turek fires back.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Bruce Russell, who's been teaching philosophy here at Wayne State University since 1978. Wow. Dr. Russell, go ahead, sir. And thank you for coming, by the way.
There are several things I agree with you on, and I'm glad you defended them, namely this kind of independence of truth and the endorsement of logic. We're on board there with each other. And the acceptance of the principle of non-contradiction, of course. And actually, although some people might be surprised, think that miracles are possible. The questions for me are not just about truth, but mainly about justification. So truth is the object of my beliefs, but whether I hold them or not depends on what evidence I have for them. So I actually have an answer to your question that you pose to atheists like me. If Christianity were true, would you accept it or believe it? And my answer is, no, that's the wrong question. If it were rational to believe it's true, I would accept it.
Yeah, that's what I mean by the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to be clear. So now the ones I don't agree with are your answers to the God exists and the resurrection issues. And I can't do this here. Of course, I do it in my philosophy of religion class, go through all those traditional, cosmological, teleological, moral arguments. And they're all open, as philosophers know, to very serious criticism. I can't do all that here. It's unfortunate, it's not a debate. I've debated Guyvid and William Lane Craig and Bert Spalding here, but this isn't a debate, so I have to limit what I have to say. The general picture is there are arguments for the existence of God, and there's a problem of evil, which I think is a killer argument against. Not your version of the argument for me, mine. So I'm just going to focus on one of the arguments for. But you can ask me about other ones if you wish.
Go ahead.
It's a matter of time.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the moral argument. So this is one I thought was the worst case that William Lane Craig and Guyvid and many other theists make, because I think there are necessary moral truths that you can know by understanding the concepts. I think it's necessarily wrong-making to rape someone. I think it's wrong to betray a friend. I think it's wrong to exploit people. I think it's wrong to harm people just for the fun of it, and so on.
We agree. The question is, what justifies that being wrong?
The answer is, it's a conceptual truth, like the truth that knowledge requires true belief, or the truth that, I don't know, 2 + 2 is 4. That doesn't mean that everyone always believed these necessary truths. I think it's a necessary truth that slavery is wrong. That, of course, doesn't mean that everybody believed it, but there are many examples in logic and math where people believed false things and only later came to see that there were truths that were necessary truths that they thought were false.
Right, but right now we're talking epistemology. How do you know something?
The question is by knowing, understanding the concepts, as in math, as in logic, and in epistemology. I gave that example. how do I know that if you know something, it's true? The answer is because the very concept of knowledge implies that's so.
Right. Knowledge, as you know, I'm just doing this for the audience.
Okay.
How you know something's called epistemology, but the object you're knowing deals with ontology. The question is, if there is no God, what is the standard that says murder is wrong and rape is wrong and love is good? And why are we obligated to obey it if there is no God?
That's equivalent to the question for me, how do we know that 2 + 2 is 4 if there's no God? The answer is we know that 2 + 2 is 4, independent of any kind of evidence or knowledge of God, because we understand the concepts. And though morality is not about numbers, it's about wrongness. And there are certain concepts that are linked necessarily to wrongness, like rape and exploitation, and the list I partly went through.
Right. The question is, why is it wrong to rape or murder if there is no God, there is no purpose to life, and we're just overgrown germs? We're just, as someone said, we're either God imagers or we're clever, murderous monkeys fighting for control over the banana supply.
That's a false dichotomy.
Why is it, though, Dr. Russell? Why is it wrong to say, or why do we have a moral obligation if there's no purpose to life?
Oh, because we can have obligations that are not tied to purposes. We're not all consequentialist about morality, but so you can have, breaking a promise can be wrong.
Why?
Well, look, this is a question I think you're asking me is, why is 2 + 2 = 4? That makes no sense. If you agree that it's conceptually necessary that if you rape somebody, you do something wrong, then it makes no sense to ask, well, how can it be wrong if there's no purpose in life or so forth?
Okay, well, first of all, you might be surprised, maybe not to learn, that I believe math is grounded in the nature of God as well. Because you don't think that math is a human conception, do you?
I know, I think it's a human discovery. They just are truths. There are always
right.
been
You're discovering truth.
But it doesn't take God for those truths to exist. 2 + 2 would = 4, regardless of whether God exists or not.
Well, how would 2 + 2 = 4 be true if nothing existed?
Well, if nothing existed, even the proposition 2 + 2 is 4, it couldn't be, but there's a proposition 2 + 2 = 4 that's necessarily true. And so there are propositions as well as lecterns and microphones and professors.
Okay, but my contention is nothing would exist unless God existed. As Leibniz said, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? And I think math is actually an argument for a mind, and the idea that our universe is mathematically describable, I think, points back to a mind who created and sustains this universe.
Well, you assume that things, there must be some reason for things to exist, but there needn't be reasons for necessary truths to exist. Certainly there needn't be the reasons you cite, namely that life has to have some other lively purpose in life, that those truths could exist. Why do they exist? Because they're necessary truths. That's the
necessary.
nature of it.
Why is anything necessary if there is no God?
Well, why is it? Don't you think? I don't know. This seems like a killer example to me, but you don't take it as one. That it's necessarily true that 2 + 2 is 4. That if you know something, what you know is true. That it's wrong to rape people. It's wrong to exploit them.
I agree with all that. I agree with you, and I are on the same page, Dr. Russell, that all those things are true. My question is what grounds those truths? Because you're not a materialist, are you?
No.
Okay, so how do you ground immaterial reality?
Why is there something rather than nothing, do you mean?
No, immaterial reality. How do you ground the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics, the laws of morality, if there's no God? How are those things grounded?
Because actually they're the best explanation of what we discover when we start investigating math and logic and whatnot.
Right, but you're talking epistemology. Again, I'm talking ontology. Why do those things exist to discover to begin with?
Well, okay. I'm giving you a reason to believe why they exist. I thought you were asking me for that. Why we should believe they exist is because they best explain our discoveries when we start doing math and logic. And all you're giving are evidential arguments. Every one of your arguments doesn't guarantee truth. It's an evidential argument. So I'm giving an evidential argument to think that there are necessary math, logic, truths, and truths about epistemology and ethics.
Well, I'm using the laws of logic and my senses in order to discover truths outside of myself.
But you're not using just logic and your senses. You're using something like inference to the best explanation.
Yes.
Well, so am I.
Okay.
I'm using inference to the best explanation to explain why you should believe that there are logical, mathematical, and ethical truths that are necessarily true, which means true in every possible
Well, I agree they're true in every possible world, but I just don't see any grounding on it on atheism. Why?
But that means you just rejected my inference to the best explanation argument for their existence that has no implications about God.
Hey guys, please, go ahead. Sorry, sir,
No,
go ahead.
I said you just rejected my inference to the best explanation why we should believe that there are math, logic, and moral truths
I'm
independently of the existence of God.
I'm asking for the grounding of those things. Obviously, math and logic are not moral issues. Morality is an obligation.
The only arguments you give for the grounding in God are inferential arguments just of the same sort, but with different conclusions. You have ontological conclusions that are based on inference to the best explanation, and I have exactly the same kind of argument to infer that there are necessary truths that don't require God's existence.
Well, that's where we disagree. I can't see how there's any obligation if we're just overgrown germs.
We're not just overgrown germs. We're people with brains, and having brains enables us to have certain emotions and thoughts and so forth that make us distinct from a lectern or a mouse.
Yes, that's true. The question is, how did we get here? And if we got here by a blind process, it doesn't matter how big of our brains are. They're just different in degree, and there's no overall arching purpose to life. It makes no difference in the end whether we murder one another or we love one another.
Oh, no, that doesn't follow at all.
Well,
you just rejected my arguments and said there are necessary moral truths.
All right, well,
thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Russell.
Too long.
Yes, thank you. We can talk some more later, but I appreciate you coming.
This exchange between Dr. Bruce Russell and the Christian apologist is a fascinating microcosm of a much larger worldview clash. Dr. Russell, a respected philosophy professor, makes it clear that he's not concerned with whether Christianity is true, but rather whether it is rational to believe it's true. That distinction reveals the modern skeptic's mindset. Belief is only valid if it meets human standards of evidentialism. What stands out most is how Russell tries to separate necessary moral truths from God. He claims actions like rape or exploitation are necessarily wrong because of the conceptual content of the terms themselves, not because there's an ultimate moral lawgiver. But here's the issue: necessary truths require necessary grounding. Why should moral obligation exist at all if we are the byproduct of unguided evolutionary forces? Atheism can describe what is, but Christianity explains why it is. Christianity offers a firm foundation for morality, reason, and human dignity because they flow from the nature of a transcendent, personal God. Without God, as Dostoevsky famously said, everything is permitted. If we are just clever murderous monkeys, as one quote in the discussion suggests, then there's no real obligation to be good, only preference. In contrast, Christianity teaches we are made in the image of God with eternal value and purpose. That is the only framework that justifies the moral intuitions Dr. Russell himself affirms. For further reading, Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Can Man Live Without God by Ravi Zacharias, The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, God and Moral Obligation by C. Stephen Evans. This video reminds us, without God, we lose the very foundation of truth we depend on.